Hi everyone, my name's Sarah Collins and I'm a lecturer in musicology at UWA's Conservatorium of Music. Welcome back to my video series on the development of the symphony. The previous video discusses the changes to instrumentation, the number of movements and the length of symphonies. This is a great place to start this discussion. The link to that video is in the video description below. Now we'll turn to form. Most of you will have learnt about sonata form. As a brief explanation, it's a form in three sections: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. The exposition moves from the tonic key to the dominant key. The development plays with the melodic ideas from the exposition, and the recapitulation is largely a repeat of the exposition, but it stays the whole time in the tonic key. Ask your teacher for more details on sonata form. Most classical period symphonies use a relatively standard sonata form in the first movement, a 3/4 dance minuet in the third movement, and a sonata rondo form in the fourth movement. The second movement could be a few different forms, either binary, ternary, or a theme and variations, most often. The first major change was the replacement of the minuet as the third movement with a scherzo. A scherzo is still written often in 3/4, but is faster than a minuet. Beethoven used a scherzo for the first time in his Fifth Symphony. In the Romantic period, the sonata form stayed in place with the traditional composers, and we see a number of sonata forms in the symphonies of composers such as Brahms, Schubert, and Schumann. They still follow the rough format of forms we discussed in the classical period works, but the sonata form tends to be longer, featured longer developments, and more frequently didn't follow the sonata form conventions that we know today. Other composers such as Berlioz used these forms in a much more dynamic way, although I'll come back to that soon. In the 20th century, form becomes much freer. Since form in the classical period is really more about key and tonality, given that composers were playing with very different harmonic rules, the forms were much looser. Take Shostakovich's 12th Symphony as an example. The third movement is a scherzo, but the other three are freer and much more episodic. What keeps pieces like this feeling structured is the repeat of musical material throughout the movement, which creates a sense of unity. Our final point of discussion is regarding what the music is about. Most classical period symphonies are what we call absolute music. For our purposes, that basically means that there is no story for the listener to follow along with, or an image that the composer directs the audience to have in their mind while they're listening. Most of Beethoven's 9 symphonies are absolute music, but his 6th symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, gives us a clue as to what the program is. Beethoven wrote the work to evoke nature, or as he said, give more an expression of the feeling of nature. This isn't program music as such, but it's quite similar, moving in that direction. In the Romantic period, Berlioz provides the clearest example of a programmed symphony. His Symphony Fantastique has a very in-depth story, and the music represents a number of specific characters and what happens to those characters over the course of the story. Another example of a programmed symphony is Richard Strauss's Sinfonia Domestica. Program music is an important part of 19th century music, and your teacher will be able to give you a number of other examples of programmatic pieces for the orchestra. In the 20th century, many composers stopped writing symphonies, but the idea of program music continues. The symphony was the primary and by far the most popular form of full orchestral work in the classical period. Alongside the concerto, these were the two pillars of orchestral composition in the time. As the 19th century progresses, composers began turning away from the symphony because of its limitations. Richard Wagner is one of the most important composers in the 19th century, but he didn't really choose to write for the orchestra on its own. His only symphony was his Symphony in C major, which he wrote at the age of 19. While composers like Shostakovich, Vaughan Williams, and Prokofiev wrote many symphonies in the early 20th century, others chose to ignore the form altogether. Debussy, Ravel, and Bartók never wrote symphonies, although they wrote a number of works for the symphony orchestra. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the symphony, I've included a list of 10 symphonies to listen to. These symphonies will give you a good sense of context of how the symphony changed over time. If you study at UWA, you can do as little as 1 unit or a complete degree in music. You can learn an instrument, have one-on-one violin lessons, write music using software like Ableton, or even learn the ukulele. If you prefer looking at the academic side of music, we have a large range of units in theory, oral skills, and music history, which can be studied as part of any undergraduate degree at UWA. For more details, head to our website, which is linked in the description below, and best of luck for your ATAR music studies this year.